A scream pierces the night aboard the 4:50 train from Paddington. A man lies dead in a locked compartment, his secrets sealed in a mysterious briefcase. Who is the frightened young woman hiding her past? What does the cryptic note mean, and why? Does a shadowy figure stalk the shadows? Join Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a deadly web of greed, betrayal, and hidden identities before the final stop. Will she catch the killer or become the next victim? Chapter 1. The whistle in the night the 4:50 train from Paddington rattled through the twilight, its wheels clattering a steady rhythm against the tracks. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window in her first-class compartment, her knitting needles clicking softly, a delicate counterpoint to the train's relentless churn. Outside, the English countryside blurred into streaks of amber and shadow, the last light of day clinging to the hedgerows. She adjusted her spectacles, her sharp eyes flitting from her wool to the other passengers, each absorbed in their own small worlds. There was something about trains, she mused, that brought out the unguarded in people of fleeting intimacy. Born of shared confinement, her compartment was sparsely occupied. A young woman in a claret-coloured coat sat opposite her, fingers nervously twisting the strap of a velvet purse. An elderly gentleman with a waxed moustache dozed in the corner, his newspaper sliding to the floor, and a wiry man in a tweed cap hunched over a notebook, scribbling furiously. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the young woman, whose pale face betrayed a restlessness that seemed more than mere travel fatigue. Her eyes darted to the window, then to her purse, as if expecting it to leap from her grasp. The train's whistle pierced the air, a mournful cry that seemed to startle the young woman. She flinched, her purse slipping to the floor with a soft thud. Miss Marple bent to retrieve it, her movements slow but deliberate. "Oh, thank you," the woman murmured, her voice low, almost swallowed by the train's rumble. Her fingers trembled as she took the purse, and Miss Marple noted a faint monogrammy stitched in gold thread. "No trouble at all, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but laced with curiosity. "Trains can be so unsettling, can't they? All this rushing about." She smiled, inviting confidence, but the young woman only nodded. Her lips pressed tight, the compartment door slid open, admitting a conductor in a crisp navy uniform. His face was flushed, his eyes darting as he scanned the passengers. "Tickets, please," he said, his voice clipped. Miss Marple handed over her ticket, observing the man's unsteady hands. He was young, barely 20, with a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the evening chill. Something was amiss, she thought, her mind already sifting through possibilities. As the conductor moved to the next compartment, Miss Marple's ears caught a faint murmur through the thin partition wall. Two voices, low and urgent, wove through. "The clatter of the train. You promised it would be clean," one said, sharp and male. No one was to know. The second voice, softer, almost pleading, replied, "I did what you asked. It's not my fault he—" The words cut off abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. Miss Marple's needles paused, her head tilting slightly. The young woman opposite glanced up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment before dropping back to her purse. The train lurched, a sudden jolt that sent the elderly gentleman's newspaper skidding across the floor. The wiry man, in the tweed cap, cursed under his breath, his pencil snapping against his notebook. Then, from somewhere down the carriage, a scream tore through the air high, raw and abruptly silenced. Miss Marple's hands stilled entirely, her heart quickening not with fear but with a familiar, quiet thrill. Trouble, she thought, had a way of finding her. The young woman Elg gasped, her purse clutched to her chest. What was that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The elderly gentleman stirred, blinking groggily, while the wiry man stood, craning his neck toward the corridor. Probably just a drunk, he muttered, but his knuckles whitened round his notebook. Miss Marple sat her knitting in her lap, her mind racing. Perhaps we should see if someone needs help, she suggested, her tone mild but firm. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and stepped into the corridor, where a small crowd had already gathered. The conductor was there, his face now ashen, fumbling with a key at the door of the next compartment. A woman in a fur stole pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, muttering about disgraceful behavior, while a burly man in a pinstripe suit demanded to know what was happening. "Stand back, please," the conductor said, his voice cracking. He pushed open the door, and a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Miss Marple, peering over the shoulder of the pinstripe-suited man, saw the cause. A body sprawled across the compartment's floor, a man in a tailored grey suit. His face turned to the side, eyes wide and unseeing. A thin trickle of blood stained the carpet beneath his head, and his hand clutched a crumpled piece of paper. "Good heavens," Miss Marple murmured, her voice steady despite the scene. She noted the man's polished shoes, the expensive cut of his suit, and the absence of any luggage. A traveller with no baggage, she thought, was either running to something or from it. The conductor, visibly shaken, stammered, He's dead. I need to fetch the station master at the next stop." He turned to the crowd, his eyes wild. "No one touch anything. Stay where you are." He hurried down the corridor, leaving the passengers in a stunned huddle. Miss Marple slipped back into her compartment, her mind already piecing together the fragments. The scream, the cryptic conversation, the nervous young woman, each a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. She resumed her seat, her needles clicking once more, though her eyes strayed to E.L., who was now staring out the window, her face pale as moonlight. "Are you quite all right, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. "That was a dreadful shock." E.L. nodded, her fingers tightening around her purse. I didn't see anything," she said quickly, too quickly. "I was just sitting here." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But it's curious, isn't it? A man like that, alone in a locked compartment. One wonders who he was meeting." Her words hung in the air, light but pointed, and E.L.'s eyes flickered with something fear, perhaps, or guilt. The elderly gentleman, now fully awake, cleared his throat. "Damned nuisance, this," he grumbled, retrieving his newspaper. "Trains aren't what they used to be. Murder, no less." His indignation seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted the way his hands shook as he folded the paper. The wiry man in the tweed cap snorted. "Murder, you're jumping to conclusions. Old man could have been a heart attack, or a fall." He returned to his notebook, but his pencil remained still, his eyes darting to the corridor. Miss Marple said nothing, her thoughts turning to the crumpled paper in the dead man's hand. A note, perhaps, a receipt. She longed to examine it, but the conductor's orders were clear. Instead, she focused on her fellow passengers, each a potential piece of the puzzle. The young woman's unease, the wiry man's defensiveness, the elderly gentleman's bluster, all were clues, if one knew how to read them. The train slowed as it approached the next station, its whistle sounding again, mournful and sharp. Outside, lanterns bobbed in the darkness, signaling the arrival of the police. Miss Marple glanced at E.L., who was now clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles gleamed white. "You might want to freshen up before we reach the station," Miss Marple suggested kindly. "The police will likely want to speak with everyone." E.L. nodded, rising unsteadily. As she stepped into the corridor, her purse slipped again, and a small object fell to the floor, a torn ticket stub, its edges frayed. Miss Marple bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing the paper. It was a return ticket to St. Mary Mead, her own village, dated for that very day. Curious, she thought, tucking the observation away. The compartment door slid shut behind E.L., and Miss Marple leaned back. Her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. The scream, the body, the whispered argument all pointed to something deeper, a tangle of motives and secrets. She thought of her garden at home, how a single weed could choke an entire flower bed if left unchecked. This, she sensed, was no ordinary crime. It was a weed with roots that ran deep. As the train ground to a halt, the platform outside buzzed with activity. Policemen in dark uniforms boarded, their voices sharp and authoritative. Miss Marple watched through the window as E.L. lingered. Near the platform's edge, her claret coat a vivid splash against the grey stone. The young woman glanced back at the train, her expression unreadable. Before slipping into the crowd, Miss Marple's needles paused once more. She had seen that look before, not fear, not guilt, but something colder, more calculated. The whistle, in the night, had signalled more than a train's journey. It had heralded a mystery, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unassuming air, was already unravelling its threads. The chapter closed with the police cordoning off the carriage, there, lanterns casting long shadows across the platform. Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag, her eyes bright with purpose. A body on a train, a nervous young woman, a whispered plotchy had seen such things before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, and she knew one truth above all: no secret could hide forever from a mind that knew where to look. Chapter 2. Shadows on the platform. The platform at Willow Junction was a hive of chaos, bathed in the flickering glow of gas lanterns. The 4:50 train from Paddington stood still, its engine hissing like a cornered beast, while policemen in dark coats swarmed the carriage where the body had been found. Miss Jane Marple lingered near the platform's edge, her shawl drawn tightly against the evening chill, her eyes scanning the crowd with the quiet intensity of a hawk. The air buzzed with whispers, fearful, curious, indignant, as passengers milled about, their faces a mix of shock and morbid fascination. The young woman in the claret coat, E.L., had vanished into the thronged moments after stepping off the train, her velvet purse clutched like a talisman. Miss Marple noted her absence with a faint frown, her mind replaying the torn ticket stub she'd glimpsed it, Mary Mead, a destination too close to her own heart to be mere coincidence. She adjusted her hat, its modest brim shielding her from the drizzle that had begun to fall, and moved closer to the cordoned-off carriage, where a burly inspector barked orders to a nervous constable. "Keep them back, Jenkins." The inspector snapped, his voice cutting through the murmur. "No one touches that carriage until the coroner arrives." The constable, barely older than the conductor, nodded frantically, his hands flapping at a cluster of onlookers. Among them was the wiry man in the tweed cap from Miss Marple's compartment, his notebook now tucked under his arm, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape. Beside him, the woman in the fur stole from earlier dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief, though Miss Marple suspected the gesture was more theatrical than genuine. She edged closer, her steps soft but purposeful, and caught a snippet of conversation from two porters leaning against a luggage cart. Heard he was a toff, that dead bloke, one muttered, his cap tilted back. No wallet, no papers, nothing but a fancy suit, and that bit of paper in his hand. The other porter, older and grizzled, spat into the gravel. I saw a chap scarper from that carriage just before the scream. Dark coat, quick as a fox, didn't look back. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A man fleeing the scene, another thread to tug. She glanced toward the station's waiting room, where a few passengers had retreated from the rain. The elderly gentleman from her compartment, his waxed moustache now slightly drooping, stood by the door, arguing with a ticket clerk about delays. His bluster, she noted, seemed a touch too loud, as if meant to draw attention. The drizzle thickened, sending most passengers scurrying for cover, but Miss Marple remained, her umbrella unopened. She preferred to feel the rain, to let it sharpen her senses. Her gaze fell on a small bench near the platform's end, where a single figure sat, hunched and solitary. It was E.L., her claret coat unmistakable, her posture rigid despite the downpour. Miss Marple approached, her steps muffled by the wet gravel, and settled beside her, offering a gentle smile. "You'll catch your death out here, my dear," she said, her voice soft but carrying a warmth that invited trust. "May I share?" "My umbrella," E.L. started, her eyes wide, but she nodded, scooting closer. I just needed air," she said, her voice brittle. "All this, it's too much." Her fingers worried the strap of her purse, and Miss Marple noticed a faint tear in the velvet, as if it had been caught on something sharp. "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, tilting her umbrella to shield them both. "A dreadful business, finding a man like that. Did you know him, perhaps? He seemed the sort to draw attention." Her tone was light, but her eyes were keen, watching for any flicker of recognition. E.L. shook her head too quickly. "No, I didn't. I never saw him before." Her gaze dropped to her lap, where her hands twisted together, betraying her words. Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence work its magic. After a moment, E.L. added, I'm trying to get away, you see, from London, from everything." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of grandmotherly concern. "Running away can be a heavy burden," she said. "I once knew a girl in St. Mary Mead who thought she could outrun her troubles, but troubles, you know, have a way of catching up." She paused, letting the words settle. "Where are you headed, if I may ask?" E.L. hesitated, her lips parting as if to answer, then closing again. "Somewhere quiet," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safe." The word safe hung between them, fragile and loaded. Miss Marple's mind turned to the ticket stub, to St. Mary Mead, a village hardly known for being a refuge for strangers. Before she could probe further, a commotion erupted near the carriage. The inspector emerged, holding a small evidence bag, his face grim. "We've got something," he called to the constable. A letter, sealed, in the man's pocket, addressed to someone on this train. The crowd buzzed anew, passengers craning to see. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A letter was a dangerous thing, too personal, too revealing. She glanced at E.L., who had gone rigid, her face pale as chalk. "A letter," Miss Marple mused aloud, her tone casual. "I wonder who it was meant for. Someone he trusted, perhaps, or feared." E.L. stood abruptly, her purse slipping to the bench. "I should go," she said, her voice tight. "I need to check on my luggage." She hurried toward the station house, leaving the purse behind. Miss Marple retrieved it, her fingers brushing something hard inside a small, cold object. Perhaps a key. She tucked the purse under her arm, resolving to return it later, and turned her attention to the platform. The wiry man in the tweed cap was now near the carriage, arguing with the constable. "I'm a journalist, damn it," he snapped, brandishing his notebook. "The public has a right to know." The constable pushed him back, but Miss Marple noted the man's keen interest, his eyes lingering on the carriage door. A journalist, she thought, or something else entirely. She approached the constable, her demeanor unassuming. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice sweet but firm. "Might an old lady ask what's being done? It's all so distressing." The constable, flustered, softened at her kindly tone. "We're waiting for the coroner, ma'am," he said. "But it's murder, no doubt. That blood on the floor wasn't from a fall." Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of concern, though her mind raced. Murder confirmed, a sealed letter, a fleeing man in a dark coat each, piece sharpened. The puzzle's edges. She glanced at the journalist, who was now scribbling furiously, and then at the elderly gentleman, who had retreated to the waiting room but was watching the scene through the window, his moustache twitching. The rain eased, leaving the platform slick and gleaming. Miss Marple returned to the bench, her thoughts swirling. EL's flight, the journalist's agitation, the letter in the inspector's hand all pointed to a web of secrets, spun tightly around the dead man. She opened EL's purse, intending to secure it, and glimpsed the glint of metal inside a tiny key, ornate and old-fashioned, unlike any for a modern lock. She closed the purse quickly, her heart quickening. A key to what? A trunk, a secret. As the police began herding passengers back onto the train, Miss Marple spotted EL emerging from the station house, her face composed but her eyes haunted. She approached, and Miss Marple handed her the purse, saying nothing about the key. "You dropped this, my dear," she said gently. EL took it, her fingers trembling, and murmured a thank you before hurrying back to the train. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her eyes sweeping the platform. The journalist had vanished, and the elderly gentleman was now deep in conversation with the woman in the fur stole, their heads bent close. Shadows moved in the lantern light, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a figure in a dark coat slip behind a stack of crates, too quick to be certain. The train's whistle sounded, sharp and impatient, calling passengers back. Miss Marple boarded, her mind alive with questions. The letter, the key, the man in the dark coat each was a clue, a whisper of something larger. As she settled into her seat, her knitting untouched, she felt the familiar stir of a mystery taking shape. The platform's shadows held secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and piercing insight, was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 3. The Locked Compartment. The 4:50 train from Paddington groaned as it resumed its journey. The platform at Willow Junction fading into the misty night. Inside the first-class carriage, the air was thick with unease. The passengers, chatter subdued by the grim discovery of the body. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes flitting between the faces in her compartment. The young woman, EL, now back in her seat, stared blankly at the velvet purse in her hands, her fingers tracing the tear in its fabric. The elderly gentleman with the waxed moustache had retreated into his newspaper, though his eyes darted nervously over the headlines. The wiry journalist in the tweed cap was absent. likely prowling the train for more details. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the inspector's words at the station. A sealed letter found in the dead man's pocket, addressed to someone on this very train. The puzzle was growing more intricate, and she felt the familiar thrill of untangling a knot. But the most tantalizing detail had come from the constable's unguarded murder, confirmed in a compartment locked from the inside. An impossible crime, or so it seemed, and Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. The train's rhythm steadied, its wheels clacking a hypnotic beat. Miss Marple rose, excusing herself with a polite murmur, and stepped into the corridor. The carriage was quieter now, the initial shock giving way to a tense hush. She moved toward the dining car, her steps slow but deliberate, her eyes noting every detail: a scuff on the carpet, a smudge on a brass handle, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. Lavender, she thought, curious. It was not a common scent on a train, and it stirred a memory of something or someone near the crime scene. The dining car was sparsely populated, its white tablecloths gleaming under the soft glow of overhead lamps. A waiter moved briskly, serving tea to a handful of passengers. At a corner table sat a new figure, a man in a charcoal suit, his face half hidden behind a copy of the Times. His polished shoes and gold cufflinks suggested wealth, but his postulate, almost predatory, caught Miss Marple's attention. She settled at a nearby table, ordering a pot of Earl Grey, and opened her knitting bag. Though her needles remained still, the waiter, a wiry man with a nervous tic, approached her table. "Tea, ma'am?" he asked, his voice strained. Miss Marple nodded, offering a warm smile. "Dreadful business, this," she said, her tone inviting confidence. "It must be terribly upsetting for the staff." The waiter hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "It's not right, ma'am," he said, lowering his voice. "That compartment was locked when we found him. No one in, no one out. Gives me the creeps, it does." He set down the teapot, his hands unsteady, and hurried away. Miss Marple poured her tea, her mind turning over the locked compartment. A locked door suggested either a suicide or a clever killer, and the blood on the carpet ruled out the former. She sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the man in the charcoal suit. He had lowered his newspaper, revealing a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes. He was watching her, she realized, though he quickly looked away when their gazes met. Curious, she thought, filing the observation away. A commotion at the far end of the dining car drew her attention. The journalist in the tweed cap had returned, now arguing with a conductor, not the young one from earlier, but an older man with a stern face. "I've a right to know what's going on," the journalist insisted, his notebook brandished like a weapon. "Who was that man? What's in that letter?" The conductor crossed his arms. "You'll know what the police tell you, sir, and no more. Now sit down, or I'll have you removed." The journalist huffed but retreated to a table, scribbling furiously. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward the man in the charcoal suit. A brief but deliberate glance. She turned her attention to the lavender scent, which seemed stronger, now wafting from the direction of the charcoal-suited man. She rose, her movements unhurried, and approached his table under the pretense of retrieving a dropped napkin. As she bent down, she caught a clearer whiff of the scent lavender, unmistakable, clinging to his sleeve. "Pardon me," she said, straightening up with a smile. "Clumsy of me. Such a lovely scent you have, lavender, isn't it?" The man's eyes narrowed, but he returned her smile, his voice smooth as polished glass. "You're observant, madam. A gift from my sister, though I'm not fond of it myself." He folded his newspaper, his cufflinks catching the light. "Shackles Hargrove," he added, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Jane Marple," she replied, shaking his hand lightly. His grip was firm, but she noted a faint tremor, as if her mention of the scent had unsettled him. "A dreadful affair. This murder," she continued, her tone conversational. "Locked doors always make things so intriguing, don't you think?" Hargrove's smile tightened. "Indeed, though I suspect the police will sort it out. They always do." He rose, excusing himself, and left the dining car, his newspaper tucked under his arm. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. Lavender? Near the crime scene. Lavender on Hargrove coincidence, or something more? She returned to her table, her tea cooling as she considered the locked compartment. The waiter's words echoed. No one in, no one out. Yet someone had entered, killed, and left, leaving the door locked behind them. A key, perhaps. Her thoughts drifted to the ornate key in E.L.'s purse, its old-fashioned design at odds with a modern train. Could it fit the compartment's lock? Unlikely, but worth considering. The dining car door slid open, admitting E.L., her claret coat, damp from the rain. She hesitated, scanning the room, then took a seat near the window, her posture rigid. Miss Marple observed her, noting the way her eyes avoided the journalist, who was now watching her with undisguised interest. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets they shared. She sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the letter in the inspector's evidence bag. Addressed to someone on the train, he'd said, E.L. Hargrove, the journalist. Each was a possibility, each a piece of the puzzle. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, where a locked room had concealed a simple tricker window left ajar, a latch tampered with. She made a mental note to inspect the compartment's window. If the police allowed it, the train lurched slightly, and the waiter reappeared, clearing tables with a clatter. Miss Marple seized the moment. "Young man," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "that poor man in the locked compartment, did you happen to notice anything odd before it happened? A sound, perhaps, or a passenger acting strangely?" The waiter glanced around, then leaned in. "I shouldn't say ma'am, but I heard a thud, like something heavy falling, just before the scream. And earlier, I saw a man in a dark coat near that carriage. He didn't board, though, just stood on the platform, watching." He straightened, his face pulling. "Don't tell the inspector I said that. I've got enough trouble." Miss Marple nodded, her expression reassuring. "My lips are sealed." A thud, a man in a dark coat, more threads, weaving tighter. She glanced at E.L., who was now stirring her tea with a trembling hand, and at the journalist, whose pencil had stilled, his eyes fixed on E.L. with an intensity that bordered on predatory. The dining car grew quieter as passengers drifted back to their seats, the train's motion lulling them into a false sense of normalcy. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way back to her compartment. As she passed the cordoned-off carriage, she paused, peering through the window. The body was gone, likely removed at Willow Junction, but the bloodstain remained. A dark blotch on the carpet, and there, on the window's edge, was a faint smudge, barely visible, a fingerprint, perhaps, or a trace of something else. She returned to her seat, her mind alight with possibilities. The locked compartment, the lavender scent, the letter, the keech was a clue, a whisper of truth. As the train rattled on, its whistle cutting through the night, Miss Marple felt the mystery deepening, its roots curling round her fellow passengers. Someone on this train was a killer, and she was determined to find out who before the journey's end brought more than just a destination. Chapter 4. Whispers of a Scandal. The 4:50 train from Paddington swayed through the darkened countryside, its windows reflecting the flickering lamps within. Miss Jane Marple sat in her compartment, her knitting needles idle, her thoughts weaving. Through the clues that had accumulated like threads in a tapestry, a locked compartment, a lavender-scented man, a nervous young woman named E.L., and a sealed letter addressed to someone aboard. The air was heavy with the weight of secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet demeanour and razor-sharp mind, felt the pull of a mystery that was growing ever more intricate. The elderly gentleman with the waxed moustache had dozed off again, his newspaper crumpled in his lap, while E.L. sat opposite, her claret coat folded neatly beside her. Her eyes were fixed on the window, though the darkness outside offered no view, only her own pale reflection. The journalist in the tweed cap had not returned, and Miss Marple wondered if he was still chasing scraps of information in the dining car or elsewhere. The train's rhythm was steady now, but the atmosphere remained taut, as if the passengers sensed the shadow of murder lingering among them. Miss Marple rose, murmuring an excuse about stretching her legs, and made her way to the corridor. The cordoned-off carriage was now guarded by a young constable, his face stern but his eyes betraying nervousness. She offered him a kind smile, which he returned hesitantly before resuming his watch. As she passed, she caught a glimpse of the compartment's interior through the half-opened door. The bloodstain on the carpet was darker now, and a faint chalk outline marked where the body had lain. The window, she noted, was slightly ajar, a detail the police seemed to have overlooked. A draft, perhaps, or a deliberate act. In the dining car, the atmosphere was livelier, though tinged with unease. Passengers sipped tea or whiskey, their conversations a low hum punctuated by nervous laughter. At a table near the bar sat the woman in the fur stole from the platform, now joined by a new figure, a stout, middle-aged woman with a pinched face and a penchant for loud jewellery. Her voice carried, sharp and gossipy, as she leaned toward her companion. "It's positively scandalous, Clara," she said, her bangles jangling. "A man like that, murdered on a train. I heard he was mixed up in something dreadful, something to do with that heiress who vanished from St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple, settling at a nearby table with a fresh pot of tea, tilted her head to listen. St. Mary Mead, again a coincidence that was no coincidence at all. She recognized the gossipy woman as Mrs. Pritchard, a type she knew well from her village, the sort who thrived on rumour but often stumbled upon truth by accident. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her ears attuned to every word. Clara, the woman in the fur stole, gasped theatrically. "An heiress, you say? Oh, Beatrice, you don't mean the Langston girl, the one who ran off with that dreadful man?" Mrs. Pritchard nodded, her eyes gleaming. "The very one. Emily Langston, they called her. Her father was a baron, you know, with a fortune in railways. When he died, she was to inherit it all, but then she disappeared. Poof! Some say she stole the money herself, others say she was kidnapped. And now this man, dead, with no papers. I'd wager he knew something about it." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. Emily Langston L. The initials matched, and the ticket stub to St. Mary Mead suddenly took on new weight. She glanced toward the corridor where EL had remained in the compartment. Her nervous demeanor now cast in a new light. An heiress fleeing a scandal, perhaps, or something darker. She set down her cup and approached Mrs. Pritchard's table. Her smile disarming. "Pardon my intrusion," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I couldn't help overhearing. Such a fascinating story about this heiress. Do you think she might be on this very train?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes widened, delighted to have an audience. "Oh, my dear, wouldn't that be something? I've heard she's a young thing, pale, with a look of someone who's seen too much. Could be anyone, really." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I saw a girl in a red coat, clutching a purse like her life depended on it. Looked terrified, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was racing. "How dreadful," she said. "And this dead man, do you suppose he was connected to her?" Mrs. Pritchard's bangles clinked as she gestured dramatically. "I'd bet my best hat on it. He was no ordinary passenger, that one. Too well-dressed, too secretive. I saw him at Paddington, you know, talking to a man in a dark coat. Looked like they were arguing, and then the other fellow slipped away before the train left." Clara gasped again, her handkerchief fluttering. "Beatrice, you should tell the police." Mrs. Pritchard waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, they don't listen to women like me. But mark my words, there's a scandal here, and it's tied to that Langston girl." Miss Marple thanked them and returned to her table, her thoughts swirling. The man in the dark coat, again, now linked to the victim before the train's departure. And Emily Langston, possibly EL, tied to a fortune and a disappearance. The pieces were aligning, but the picture remained incomplete. She needed more, something tangible. As she poured another cup of tea, the dining car door slid open, admitting Charles Hargrove, the man in the charcoal suit. His lavender-scented presence was unmistakable, and Miss Marple noted the way he scanned the room before taking a seat near the bar. His polished exterior was intact, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness in his jaw. He ordered a whiskey, his voice low, and glanced at Mrs. Pritchard, who was still chattering about. Scandals, did he overhear? Miss Marple wondered, watching him closely. The waiter from earlier approached her table, his nervous tick more pronounced. "More tea, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes darting toward Hargrove. "No, thank you," Miss Marple said, then lowered her voice. "But tell me, did you notice that gentleman earlier, near the locked compartment, the one with the fine suit?" The waiter hesitated, then nodded. Mum. He was in the corridor before we found the body. Asked me where the dining car was, but he didn't go there right away. Kept looking at his watch, like he was waiting for something." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful." The waiter scurried off, and she turned her attention to Hargrove, who was now sipping his whiskey, his eyes fixed on the window, waiting for something or someone. She wondered that as she rose to return to her compartment. Her foot brushed against something under the tabbouleh, small, folded piece of paper, half hidden beneath a napkin. She bent to retrieve it, her movements discreet, and slipped it into her sleeve. Back in her seat, she unfolded it carefully, revealing a series of numbers and letters scrawled in a hurried hand. L17, 4:30 SM. Her heart quickened. St. Mary. Mead again, and for 30th time the train had departed Paddington. A code, perhaps, or a meeting time. She tucked the note into her knitting bag, her mind racing. The scandal Mrs. Pritchard spoke of, the coded note. Hargrove's nervous watch, checking all, pointed to a conspiracy that stretched beyond a single murder, and E.L., with her torn purse and haunted eyes, was at its centre. Miss Marple glanced at the young woman, who was now pretending to read a book, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The train's whistle sounded, signalling an approaching station. Miss Marple leaned back, her thoughts a whirl of connections. The locked compartment, the lavender scent, the missing heiress, and now a coded note each was a clue, a whisper of a larger truth. As the train slowed, she resolved to keep a closer eye on E.L. and Hargrove, and to find out what or who L17 referred to. The scandal was unfolding, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring instinct, was determined to unravel it before it claimed another victim. Chapter 5. The man in the grey coater 4:50 train from Paddington rattled on through the night, its wheels singing a relentless song against the tracks. Inside, the air was thick with suspicion, the passengers' faces etched with unease as the reality of a murder among them settled like dust. Miss Jane Marple sat in her compartment, her knitting bag at her side, the coded Notel 17, 4:30 SM tucked securely within. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, darted between E.L., who sat rigidly clutching her velvet purse, and the empty seat where the journalist in the tweed cap had been. The elderly gentleman with the waxed moustache snored softly, his newspaper a crumpled shield across his chest. Miss Marple's mind churned, piecing together the fragments of the mystery, the locked compartment, the lavender-scented Charles Hargrove, the gossip of a missing heiress, and now a cryptic note hinting at a connection to St. Mary Mead. The mention of a man in a dark coat, seen arguing with the victim before the train's departure, lingered in her thoughts. Was he the same figure the porter had seen fleeing the carriage? She needed more a glimpse, a clue, something to tie the threads together. The train's rhythm faltered, a slight hitch that stirred her from her reverie. She rose, murmuring about needing a breath of air, and stepped into the corridor. The passageway was dim, the lamps casting long shadows that danced with the train's motion. As she approached the luggage car, a flicker of movement caught her agile figure in a grey coat, not dark as the porter had described, but close enough to spark suspicion. He was hunched near the luggage car door, his back to her, tampering. With a lock, Miss Marple paused, her heart quickening not with fear but with the thrill of discovery. She slipped behind a stack of crates, her small frame blending into the shadows. The man in the grey coat glanced over his shoulder, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat, but his movements were furtive, deliberate. He produced a small tooler-pick, perhaps, and worked at the lock until it clicked open. With a final glance around, he slipped inside, the door closing softly behind him. She waited, counting the seconds, her mind racing. The luggage car was an odd place for a passenger, unless he was hiding something or searching for it. She thought of the victim's lack of luggage, the sealed letter, and the key in E.L.'s purse. Could the grey-coated man be after something the dead man had carried? The corridor was empty now, save for the distant murmur of voices from the dining car. Miss Marple approached the luggage car door, her steps silent on the carpet. She pressed her ear to the door, hearing faint rustling, like papers being shuffled. She considered knocking, but thought better of it. Confrontation was not her way. Instead, she returned to her compartment, resolving to find an ally who could help her investigate without arousing suspicion. Back in her seat, she noticed E.L. absence. Her claret coat was gone, though her purse remained tucked beneath the seat. The elderly gentleman stirred, muttering about delays, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She needed someone with access to the luggage car, someone young and curious. Her thoughts turned to the young porter she'd seen at Willow Junction, a lad named Tommy, who had been eager to help despite his nervousness. She found him in the next carriage, polishing brass fittings with a rag. His freckled face lit up when he saw her, though his eyes were wary. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice tinged with a country lilt. "Still a right mess, this business." "Indeed it is, Tommy," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but purposeful. "I wonder if you might help an old lady with a small matter. The luggage car do you ever check it during the journey?" Tommy's rag paused. "Sometimes, ma'am, if there's a problem. Why do you ask?" She leaned closer, her voice low. "I saw a man in a grey coat near the luggage car just now, acting rather oddly. I thought perhaps you might know if anything valuable was stored. There's something a passenger might want to find." Tommy's eyes widened. "A grey coat? Blimey, I saw a fellow like that at Paddington before we left. He was arguing with the dead man out by the platform. Looked proper heated, it did. I didn't think much of it then, but—" He trailed off, glancing down the corridor. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Arguing, you say? Could you describe him?" Tommy scratched his head. Tallish, thin, with a hat pulled low. Didn't see his face clear, but he had a grey coat. Right enough. And the dead man, he was carrying a briefcase, black leather, locked tight. I noticed 'cause he kept it close, like it was precious. A briefcase. Miss Marple's mind flashed to the coded note, the sealed letter, the key in E.L.'s purse. "Is that briefcase still in the luggage car?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Tommy shook his head. "Dunno, ma'am. The police took most of the victim's things at Willow Junction, but I could check, if that grey-coated fellow's poking around, though I'd best tell the conductor." "Not yet," Miss Marple said quickly, her hand resting lightly on his. Let's be discreet, shall we? If you could just keep an eye on the luggage car and let me know if you see that man again, I'd be most grateful." Tommy nodded, his face earnest. "Right, ma'am. I'll watch for him." He hesitated, then added, "You think he's the killer, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I think, Tommy, that people often reveal themselves when they think no one's watching. Now, off you go." She returned to her compartment, her thoughts buzzing. A grey-coated man, an argument, a locked briefcase, each piece sharpened the mystery's edges. As she settled into her seat, E.L. reappeared, her coat damp and her face flushed, as if she'd been hurrying. "Feeling better, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. E.L. nodded, avoiding her gaze. "Just needed some air," she murmured, retrieving her purse. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers checked its contents, as if ensuring something was still there. The key, perhaps. The train slowed, approaching another station, its lights, a faint glow in the distance. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the corridor, where a shadow moved briefly past the window. She couldn't be sure, but it looked like the grey-coated man, his hat low, his stride quick. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her composure, her mind already planning her next move. She leaned toward E.L., her voice soft. "You know, my dear, trains are such curious places. So many secrets, all locked away in one carriage or another. Have you ever lost something on a journey? A key, perhaps, or a letter?" E.L.'s head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "I know, I haven't lost anything," she said, her voice tight. She clutched her purse closer, her knuckles white dot. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. Of course, just an old lady's fancy, but her mind was far from idle. The grey-coated man, the briefcase, E.L.'s fear-all were linked, she was certain, and the coded note, with its cryptic L17430 SM, was the key to unlocking them. As the train pulled into the station, its whistle a sharp cry in the night, Miss Marple glanced out the window. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a lone figure in a grey coat, standing at the far end, his face hidden. He turned and vanished into the darkness, as if sensing her gaze. She leaned back, her knitting untouched, her thoughts racing. The man in the grey coat was a shadow in the mystery, but shadows, she knew, could be chased. And Miss Marple was determined to catch this one before it faded entirely. Chapter 6. Secrets in the suitcase. The 4:50 train from Paddington pressed on through the night, its wheels clattering a restless rhythm against the tracks. Inside, the passengers were subdued, their faces shadowed by the lingering spectre of murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her compartment, her knitting bag at her side, the cryptic Notel 430 SM burning in her mind like a hidden ember. The young woman, E.L., sat opposite, her claret coat folded neatly, her hands clasped tightly around her velvet purse. The elderly gentleman with the waxed moustache had retreated to the dining car, leaving the compartment quieter, though the tension remained palpable. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled around the man in the grey coat. Seen tampering with the luggage car and the black leather briefcase Tommy, the porter, had described locked, precious, and now possibly missing. The connection to E.L.'s ornate key, tucked away in her purse, was too tantalizing to ignore. Was the briefcase the key's target, or was it merely another piece of the puzzle? She needed to see the luggage car for herself, but discretion was paramount. The train slowed, its brakes squealing as it approached a small, dimly lit station. Miss Marple seized the opportunity, rising with a murmured excuse about needing a moment to freshen up. She slipped into the corridor, her steps soft but purposeful, and made her way toward the luggage car. The passageway was empty, save for a faint creak of the train's timbers and the distant hum of voices from the dining car. As she neared the luggage car door, she paused, her ears straining for any sound. The rustling she'd heard earlier was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. She tested the door, expecting it to be locked, but it yielded with a soft click. Curious, she thought, her heart quickening. She stepped inside, the air cool and heavy, with the scent of leather and dust. The luggage car was a jumble of trunks, suitcases, and crates, stacked haphazardly under the dim glow of a single lamp. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. Near the back, half hidden behind a pile of valises, was a black leather briefcase, its surface scuffed but intact, a small brass lock gleaming at its clasp. Miss Marple's breath caught. This had to be the victim's briefcase, the one Tommy had described. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the cold leather, when a noiseless soft scuff of boots made her freeze. She ducked behind a crate, her small frame swallowed by the shadows, and peered out. The man in the grey coat stood at the far end of the car, his hat low, his hands rifling through a trunk. He muttered to himself, his words indistinct but urgent, and tossed aside a bundle of papers before moving to another suitcase. She watched, her mind racing. He was searching for something specific, but was it the briefcase or something else? She needed to act before he found it tore her. She glanced at the briefcase, noting its lock. The key in EL's purse flashed in her mind, Whodunit, old-fashioned, perhaps a match. She had to get the briefcase to safety, but confronting the man was out of the question. An idea sparked. She reached into her knitting bag, pulling out a small ball of yarn. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it toward the opposite corner, where it landed with a soft thud against a crate. The man in the grey coat spun around, his hand darting to his pocket as if reaching for a weapon. He crept toward the sound, his movements cautious, giving Miss Marple the moment she needed. She grabbed the briefcase, tucking it under her shawl, and slipped out of the luggage car, closing the door silently behind her. Back in the corridor, her heart pounded, but her expression remained serene. She returned to her compartment, the briefcase hidden beneath her shawl, and settled into her seat. EL glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she said nothing. Miss Marple's mind was already at work, planning her next move. She needed to open the briefcase, but not with EL watching and the grey-coated man still lurking. The train jolted, signaling its departure from the station. Miss Marple excused herself again, this time heading for the small lavatory at the end of the carriage, where she could examine the briefcase in private. Inside, she locked the door and set the case on the narrow sink. The brass lock was sturdy, but the key in EL's purse might fit. She hesitated, weighing the ethics of borrowing it without permission, but the urgency of the situation won out. She'd return it before EL noticed. She slipped back to the compartment, where EL was now dozing, her purse resting loosely in her lap. With the deftness of a seasoned observer, Miss Marple reached for the purse, her fingers slipping inside. To retrieve the key, it was heavier than she'd expected, its intricate design suggesting an antique, perhaps for a safe or a private lockbox. She returned to the lavatory, her movements swift but calm, and tried the key in the briefcase's lock. It turned with a satisfying click. Inside were a handful of letters, a photograph, and a small ledger. The photograph showed a young woman, strikingly similar to EL, standing beside a man who resembled the victim, their expressions tense. The letters were addressed to EL, their contents cryptic but hinting at a dispute over money fortune, perhaps tied to the Langston estate Mrs. Pritchard had mentioned. The ledger listed transactions, large sums moving between accounts, labelled only with initials, EL, JR, CH. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. CH, Charles Hargrove. She tucked the contents back into the briefcase, her mind racing. The photograph confirmed EL's connection to the victim, and the ledger suggested a financial motive. But why was the grey-coated man searching the luggage car? Was he after the briefcase, or something else entirely? A sudden knock at the lavatory door startled her. "Ma'am, you all right in there?" It was Tommy, the porter, his voice laced with concern. "Yes, dear, quite all right," Miss Marple called, her tone steady. She hid the briefcase under her shawl again and opened the door, smiling at Tommy. "Just a moment's privacy. Any sign of our friend in the grey coat?" Tommy's face was pale. "He's gone, ma'am. I checked the luggage car after you mentioned him. Door was unlocked, and there's a mess trunks opened, papers scattered. But no sign of him now." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Tommy. Keep this between us, won't you?" She slipped the key back into EL's purse as she returned to her seat, her movements unnoticed as EL stirred awake. The train's lights flickered, plunging the carriage into darkness for a heartbeat before they flared back to life. A gasp escaped EL, her eyes wide with panic. What was that? She whispered, clutching her purse. Just a fault in the wiring. I expect, Miss Marple said, her voice soothing but her mind alert. The flicker felt deliberate, a distraction or a warning. She glanced toward the corridor where a shadow moved swiftly past, too quick to identify. Then a shout from the luggage car echoed through the train. Thief! A voice cried, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Miss Marple's heart raced, but she remained tan-system. The response was cut off due to reaching the word limit. Here's the continuation to complete Chapter 6, ensuring it remains engaging, avoids repetition, and maintains a satisfying yet suspenseful end. Eve, a voice cried, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Miss Marple's heart raced, but she remained composed, her mind piecing together the implications. The shout suggested the grey-coated man had been discovered. Had he staged the chaos to cover his tracks? She tucked the briefcase tighter under her shawl, knowing its contents were too valuable to risk losing. The corridor erupted with activity as the conductor and a policeman pushed through, heading toward the luggage car. Passengers peered out of their compartments, their whispers a low buzz of alarm. EL's eyes followed the commotion, her face pale, her fingers tightening around her purse. Miss Marple noted her fear, wondering if EL knew what the briefcase contained or if she feared who might be after it. She leaned toward EL, her voice gentle but probing. My dear, you look quite shaken. Is there something you'd like to share? Secrets can be such a burden, you know. EL's lips parted, then closed, her gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know what you mean, she murmured, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. Of course. But if you ever need a listener, I'm here. She sat back, the briefcase heavy against her side, its secrets a burning question. The photograph, the letters. The ledger all pointed to a tangled web of greed and betrayal, with EL at its heart. And the grey-coated man, now vanished, was a loose thread she couldn't ignore. The train's whistle sounded again, sharp and urgent, as the lights stabilized. The conductor's voice boomed, ordering passengers to remain seated while the luggage car was searched. Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The grey-coated man had been searching for something likely the briefcase she now held. Its contents could unravel the murder, but they also put her in danger. She needed to get the briefcase to the police, but not before understanding its full significance. As the train rattled on, the shouts from the luggage car faded, replaced by an uneasy calm. Miss Marple glanced at EL, whose eyes were now fixed on her purse, as if it held her own secrets. The coded note, the key, the briefcase, the grey-coated man each, was a piece of a puzzle that grew darker with every mile. The chapter closed with Miss Marple slipping the briefcase into her knitting bag, her resolve firm. She would protect its secrets and uncover the truth, but the shadow of the grey-coated man loomed, a threat still at large, leaving her and the reader bracing for what lay ahead at the next station. Chapter 7. The Midnight Confession. The 4:50 train from Paddington pressed onward, its steady clatter a stark contrast to the turmoil within. The air in Miss Jane Marple's compartment was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of the murder pressing on every passenger. The black leather briefcase, now hidden in her knitting bag, felt like a silent conspirator, its contents a photograph, cryptic letters, and a ledger pointing to a web of secrets involving EL, the missing heiress, and possibly Charles Hargrove. The grey-coated man's intrusion in the luggage car lingered in Miss Marple's mind. a shadow that refused to resolve into clarity. E.L. sat opposite, her claret coat draped over her knees, her velvet purse clutched tightly, her eyes red-rimmed and restless, darted to the corridor, where the faint sounds of the police search echoed. The elderly gentleman with the waxed moustache had returned, his newspaper abandoned as he muttered about the indignity of delays. The journalist in the tweed cap was still absent, likely sniffing out more details, his absence as telling as his presence. Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The coded Notel 17430. And the ornate key from E.L.'s purse forming a constellation of clues. The ledger's initials, C.H., suggested Hargrove's involvement. But the grey-coated man's motives remained elusive. Was he a thief, a killer, or both? She needed to know more about E.L., whose fears seemed to deepen with every passing mile. The train's lights flickered again, a brief stutter that drew a gasp from E.L. Miss Marple seized the moment, her voice soft but deliberate. "My dear, you seem terribly on edge. Is it the murder or something closer to home?" E.L.'s hands froze on her purse, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment before dropping. It's just awful, that's all," she stammered. "A man dead, right here on the train. Who wouldn't be shaken?" Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle but her gaze piercing. "Of course, but sometimes fear comes from what we know, not what we don't. If you're carrying a burden, sharing it might lighten the load." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. E.L.'s lips trembled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might break. Then, in a whisper barely audible over the train's rumble, E.L. spoke. "He was my brother," she said, her voice cracking. "The man who died. Edward. I didn't want anyone to know." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. "Your brother," she repeated softly. "I'm so sorry, my dear. That must be a terrible shock. Why didn't you tell the police?" E.L.'s eyes filled with tears, but her voice grew steadier. "Because he was looking for me. He wanted to drag me back to London, to that awful man I ran from. Edward said he'd tell him where I was if I didn't give him the money, the inheritance. I couldn't let him ruin everything." Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle but probing. "This man you ran from someone dangerous, I take it?" E.L. nodded, her fingers twisting the purse's strap. "Reginald, my fiancé, or so he called himself. He's cruel, manipulative. Edward was working with him, I think, to get the money. I ran to St. Mary Mead to hide, but Edward found me. He boarded this train to force me back." The confession was a floodgate, and Miss Marple listened intently, her mind cataloguing every detail. The photograph in the briefcase, showing E.L. with a man resembling the victim, now made sense. Edward, her brother, tied to a fortune and a dangerous fiancé. But who was C.H. in the ledger, and where did the grey-coated man fit? Before she could press further, a shadow passed the compartment door, and E.L. froze, her eyes wide. Miss Marple followed her gaze, catching a glimpse of a figure tall, thin, in a grey coat, before it vanished down the corridor. The same man. She was certain, and his presence so soon after E.L.'s confession was no coincidence. The train lurched, slowing for another station, its whistle a low moan in the night. Miss Marple glanced at her knitting bag, the briefcase hidden within, and made a decision. She needed to protect E.L. and the evidence, but she also needed to understand Hargrove's role. His lavender-scented handkerchief, his nervous watch, checking could he be C.H., the third initial in the ledger. She rose, her movements calm but purposeful. "Stay here, my dear," she said to Eel. "I'll fetch you some tea. You've had a dreadful shock." El nodded, her face pale, and Miss Marple stepped into the corridor, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder. The dining car was quieter now, the late hour thinning the crowd. Charles Hargrove sat alone at a corner table, his whiskey untouched, his eyes fixed on a small pocket watch. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Mr. Hargrove, isn't it? Such a trying evening. May I join you?" Hargrove started, his watch snapping shut. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "A terrible business, this murder. I trust you're coping." "As well as can be expected," she replied, settling across from him. She noted the watch again, its face frozen at 4:50, the exact time of the train's departure and the murder. "That's a fine watch," she said, her tone casual, "though it seems to have stopped. Curious for such a precise gentleman." Hargrove's smile faltered, his fingers tightening round the watch. "A sentimental piece," he said quickly. "It belonged to my father. I keep it for memory, not time." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Sentimental things can be so revealing," she said. "Like a letter or a photograph. They tell stories we'd rather keep hidden." Her words were light, but they landed like a dart, and Hargrove's jaw twitched. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the car. The journalist in the tweed cap burst in, his notebook flapping, his face flushed with excitement. "They've found something," he shouted, drawing every eye. "In the luggage car a torn glove, monogrammed. The police think it's the killer's." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A glove, another clue, possibly tied to the grey-coated man. She glanced at Hargrove, who had gone pale, his hand slipping to his pocket as if checking for something. She made a mental note to find Tommy, the porter, and confirm the glove's details as the journalist continued his tirade, drawing the waiter and other passengers into a heated debate. Miss Marple noticed a woman lingering near the dining car door. It was Mrs. Pritchard, the gossipy woman from earlier, her bangles glinting as she leaned forward, eavesdropping. But her eyes weren't on the journalist, they were on EL's compartment, visible through the glass. Miss Marple's instincts flared. Mrs. Pritchard had overheard EL's confession. She was certain, and her sly glance suggested she was already spinning a new tale. The train's whistle sounded, signalling the station's departure. Miss Marple rose, excusing herself from Hargrove, who seemed relieved to see her go. She returned to her compartment, her mind racing. EL's confession had cracked open the mystery, but it also painted her as a target. The grey-coated man, Hargrove's stopped watch, the monogrammed glove, and Mrs. Pritchard's eaves were threads in a tightening net. As she settled into her seat, the briefcase heavy in her bag, Miss Marple knew the truth was close, but so was danger. The midnight confession had set the stage, but the next act would require all her cunning to unmask the killer before the train reached its final stop. Chapter 8. The Trap at Willow Junction. The 4:50 train from Paddington rattled toward Willow Junction. Its second stop since the murder, the air inside heavy with suspicion and the faint hum of the engine. Miss Jane Marple sat in her compartment, the black leather briefcase still hidden in her knitting bag, its contents a photograph, letters, and a ledger burning with secrets. EL's confession that the victim, Edward, was her brother had shifted the mystery's shape, casting her as both a potential target and a suspect. The grey-coated man, Charles Hargrove's stopped watch, And the monogrammed glove found in the luggage car were threads Miss Marple was determined to weave together. But she needed to act carefully. The killer was still aboard the compartment. Was quieter now, with E.L. staring blankly at her velvet purse, her face pale and drawn. The elderly gentleman with the waxed moustache had retreated to the dining car again, muttering about the inconvenience, while the journalist in the tweed cap was likely chasing the latest gossip about the glove. Miss Marple's mind churned. The coded Notel 17 for 30. Esmond, Mrs. Pritchard's eavesdropping, adding new layers to the puzzle. She needed to test her suspicions, to draw the killer out without exposing herself or E.L. As the train slowed, its brakes squealing, Miss Marple formed a plan. Willow Junction offered a chance to set a subtle trap, to spread a rumor that might flush out the guilty. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way to the dining car, where the atmosphere was a mix of nervous chatter and forced cheer. Mrs. Pritchard sat at a table with Clara, the woman in the fur stole, her bangles clinking as she recounted the glove's discovery with relish. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Good evening, ladies," she said, settling nearby with a cup of tea. "Such a stir about that glove. I heard a rumor quite shocking. Really, that the police found a witness who saw someone tampering with the locked compartment before the murder." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes lit up, her gossip-hungry nature taking the bait. "A witness, you say," she gasped, leaning forward. "Who was it? What did they see?" Miss Marple shook her head, her expression one of innocent concern. "Oh, I'm not sure of the details, but they say it was someone in a fine suit, acting most suspiciously. The police are keeping it quiet, but word travels fast on a train, doesn't it?" Clara clutched her handkerchief. "A fine suit. That sounds like that gentleman Mr. Hargrove, wasn't it? Always so polished, but there's something off about him." Mrs. Pritchard nodded eagerly. "I knew it. I saw him near that carriage earlier, looking all furtive, and that lavender scent of his positively cloying." She lowered her voice, her bangles stilling. "Do you think he's the killer?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling. "One never knows, does one? But a witness could change everything." She let the words linger, planting the seed. Mrs. Pritchard, predictably, took up the tale, whispering to Clara, who gasped, and glanced toward the bar where Charles Hargrove sat, his whiskey untouched, his face taut. The train pulled into Willow Junction, its platform bustling with porters and a fresh contingent of police. Miss Marple watched as Hargrove rose, his movements jerky, and stepped onto the platform, his eyes scanning the crowd. Her trap was working. He was rattled, his polished facade cracking. She followed at a distance, her knitting bag heavy with the briefcase, and spotted Tommy, the young porter, near a luggage cart. "Tommy," she said softly, drawing him aside. "Any sign of that grey-coated man?" He shook his head, his freckled face serious. "Not since the luggage car, ma'am. But the police found that glove monogrammed with an R. They're searching everyone's bags now, looking for a match." Miss Marple's mind raced. An R, Reginald, E.L.'s dangerous fiancé, or a red herring. She thanked Tommy and moved toward the station house, where passengers were being questioned. Hargrove stood near the ticket office, his posture tense, his hand repeatedly checking his pocket. She noted a faint bulge, perhaps a glove, or something more incriminating. She approached Mrs. Pritchard, who was now regaling a group of passengers, with the witness rumor, her voice carrying across the platform. "They say the witness saw it all," she declared, her bangles jangling. A man in a fine suit, sneaking about the compartment. Hargrave's head snapped up, his face pulling. He pushed through the crowd, heading toward the station's exit, his pace quickening. Miss Marple's heart raced. Her trap had worked too well, and he was slipping away. She needed to act before he vanished. She caught Tommy's eye and nodded toward Hargrove. "Keep an eye on him, dear," she whispered. "He's in a hurry to leave." Tommy nodded, slipping into the crowd with the ease of youth. Miss Marple returned to the train, where Eel was waiting in the compartment, her eyes wide with fear. "They're searching everyone," she whispered. "What if they find something?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "Let them do their work, my dear. The truth has a way of coming out." But her thoughts were on the briefcase, still hidden in her bag. She needed to examine its contents further, but not with EL so close. As the police began boarding, Miss Marple slipped into the corridor, heading for the dining car. There she found the journalist in the tweed cap, his notebook open, his face alight with excitement. "They're saying it's a conspiracy," he declared to a waiter. "That glove points to someone powerful, someone with money." Miss Marple paused, her mind turning over the monogram R. She needed to see the glove to confirm its significance. She approached the waiter, her tone gentle. "Young man, do you know where they're keeping that glove they found?" "An old lady's curiosity, you understand." The waiter hesitated, then leaned in. "It's with the inspector, ma'am, in the station house. But I heard it's got blood on it, same as the carpet in the compartment." Blood. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The glove was no mere clue, it was a direct link to the killer. She thanked the waiter and returned to the platform, where the police were now searching passengers' bags. Hargrove was nowhere to be seen, but Tommy reappeared, his face flushed. "He's gone, ma'am," Tommy whispered. Slipped into the crowd by the ticket office. Looked like he was meeting someone, a man in a grey coat. Miss Marple's breath caught. The grey-coated man again, now linked to Hargrove. She glanced at the station house, where the inspector emerged, holding a small evidence bag. Inside, she glimpsed the glove leather, monogrammed, stained with a dark smear. Her trap had flushed Hargrove out, but it had also revealed a new connection, one that tightened the net around the killer. As the train's whistle signaled departure, Miss Marple boarded, her mind racing. The glove, the grey-coated man, Hargrove's flight all pointed to a conspiracy deeper than she'd imagined. She settled into her seat, the briefcase heavy in her bag, and glanced at EL, whose fear was now palpable. The trap at Willow Junction had worked, but it had also raised the stakes. The killer was close, and Miss Marple knew she had to move quickly before the grey-coated man or Hargrove struck again. Chapter 9. The heiress's gambit. The 4:50 train from Paddington surged through the night, its wheels a relentless drumbeat against the tracks, carrying its passengers closer to their destinations and deeper into a web of intrigue. Miss Jane Marple sat in her compartment, the weight of the black leather briefcase in her knitting bag a constant reminder of the secrets it held. A photograph linking EL to the murdered Edward, cryptic letters, and a ledger with the initials CH, likely Charles Hargrove. The monogrammed glove, stained with blood and marked with an R, had sent Hargrove fleeing at Willow Junction, and the grey-coated man's reappearance, meeting him in the crowd, tightened the knot of suspicion. Miss Marple's trap had stirred the hornet's nest, but the killer remained at large, and the danger was palpable. EL, the young woman in the claret coat, sat opposite, her velvet purse clutched tightly, her eyes hollow with fear. The elderly gentleman with a waxed moustache was dozing again, his snores a soft counterpoint to the train's rhythm. The journalist in the tweed cap had not returned, likely chasing the latest whispers about the glove. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together E.L.'s confession that Edward was her brother, killed to silence his threat to expose her to a dangerous fiancé. Reginald danned the coded note. L17, 4:30 S, pointing to St. Mary Mead. The gloves suggested Reginald's involvement, but the grey-coated man's role was still a shadow she couldn't grasp. The train's lights flickered. A brief stutter that drew a gasp from E.L. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "My dear, you're safe here, but secrets have a way of slipping out. If you know anything about that glove or the man in the grey coat, it might be best to share it now." E.L.'s eyes widened, her fingers tightening on her purse. "I don't know anything about a glove," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I saw him. The man in the grey coat. At Paddington, before we left. He was watching Edward, following him. I thought he was just a stranger, but now..." She trailed off, her face paling. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet encouragement. "You were running from Reginald. You said, could this man be working for him?" E.L. hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe. Reginald has people-men he pays to do his bidding. Edward warned me about them. That's why I ran to St. Mary Mead, to hide where no one would look for me." The confession hung heavy, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the briefcase. Its contents tied E.L. to Edward and hinted at a fortune, but the grey-coated man's pursuit suggested he was after something specific, perhaps the ledger, or something yet undiscovered. She needed to protect E.L., but she also needed to draw out the grey-coated man before he struck again. The train slowed, approaching another station, its platform a blur of lanterns in the darkness. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. "Stay here, my dear," she said to E.L. "I'll see if the police have any news." But her true purpose was to find Tommy, the young porter, and learn more about the grey-coated man's movements. In the corridor, the air was cool, the faint scent of lavender lingering, a reminder of Hargrove. She moved toward the platform, where passengers milled about, their faces lit by the flickering lamps. Tommy was near a luggage cart, his freckled face tense as he scanned the crowd. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Tommy, any sign of our grey-coated friend?" He shook his head, his voice low. "Not since Willow Junction, ma'am. But the police are on edge, say. That glove's got them thinking the killer's still on the train. They're watching everyone now." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the glove's monogram. R for Reginald? Perhaps, but it could also be a misdirection. She needed to see E.L. confront her fears, to draw out the truth and the killer. She returned to the compartment, where E.L. was now pacing, her purse abandoned on the seat. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but urgent, "the police will soon want to speak with you about Edward. If you're the heiress they're whispering about, it's best to tell them yourself. Hiding only makes you look guilty." E.L.'s eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "You're right, I can't keep running. But Reginald he'll find me if I come forward. He's ruthless." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Leave that to the police, and to me. We'll keep you safe." But her mind was already spinning a plan. She needed to orchestrate a distraction, to flush out the grey-coated man and confirm his connection to Hargrove or Reginald. As the train prepared to depart, Miss Marple slipped into the dining car, where Mrs. Pritchard was holding court. her bangles clinking as she recounted the glove's discovery to a small crowd. Miss Marple caught her eye and leaned in, her voice low. "Mrs. Pritchard, I heard the police suspect the heiress herself might be on this train. They're planning to question a young woman in a red coat soon." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes gleamed, and within moments she was spreading the rumour, her voice carrying to every corner of the car. Miss Marple watched as the news rippled, reaching the ears of a man at the bar stool, thin, in a grey coat, his hat pulled low. He stiffened, his hand pausing on his glass, then slipped out of the car. His movements swift. Miss Marple's heart raced. The grey-coated man, reacting to the rumour, was on the move. She followed at a distance, her small frame blending into the crowd as the train lurched forward. He moved toward the luggage car, his pace urgent, and she signaled Tommy, who was nearby, to follow. "Keep him in sight, dear," she whispered, "but don't let him see you." Tommy nodded, slipping into the corridor, while Miss Marple returned to EL. "Come with me," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to the police now. It's the only way." EL hesitated, then followed, her purse clutched tightly. In the station master's office, a temporary police post. Miss Marple found the inspector, his face grim as he examined the glove. She introduced EL, her tone calm but authoritative. "This young lady has something to tell you about the victim. She's his sister, and she's been running from danger." EL's story poured out. Edward, Reginald, the inheritance, the grey-coated man shadowing her. The inspector listened, his eyes narrowing, but before he could respond, a shout came. From the platform, Tommy burst in, breathless. "He's running, ma'am." The great-coated man headed for the tracks. Miss Marple's plan had worked. The rumour had flushed him out. She urged the inspector to act, and he rallied his men. Chasing the figure into the night, EL sank into a chair, trembling but relieved, her truth finally spoken. Miss Marple glanced at her knitting bag, the briefcase secure, and noted a new clue, a monogrammed glove identical to the one in evidence, half hidden in the grey-coated man's abandoned seat on the platform. The chapter closed with the trains, whistle piercing the night, the police in pursuit, and Miss Marple's mind alight with possibilities. The grey-coated man was a hired thug, she was certain, but for whom? Reginald, Hargrove, or someone else? EL's gambit had exposed her, but it had also drawn the killer closer. The net was tightening, and Miss Marple knew the final stop would reveal the truth or claim another victim. Chapter 10. The final stop. The 4:50 train from Paddington neared its final destination, the small station of St. Mary Mead, its lights a faint beacon in the pre-dawn mist. The air inside the carriage was taut, the passengers' faces etched with exhaustion and unease, the shadow of murder clinging to every moment. Miss Jane Marple sat in her compartment, her knitting bag heavy with the black leather briefcase, its contents letters, a photograph, and a ledger now, a map to the truth. EL's confession that the victim, Edward, was her brother, and her fear of the ruthless Reginald had unravelled much of the mystery. But the grey-coated man's escape at the last station and the monogrammed glove, marked with an R, kept the killer's identity just out of reach. Charles Hargrove's nervous demeanour and lavender scent, coupled with the ledger's initials, CH, pointed to his involvement. But Miss Marple sensed a larger force at play. The compartment was nearly empty now, the elderly gentleman with the waxed moustache having disembarked at the previous stop, muttering about the indignity of it all. EL, her claret coat draped over her shoulders, sat silently, her velvet purse abandoned on the seat, her eyes hollow but resolute after her confession. To the police, the journalist in the tweed cap was nowhere to be seen, likely chasing the story's end, while Mrs. Pritchard's gossip had quieted, her bangles still as she dozed in the dining car. Miss Marple's mind churned. The coded Notel 17430. SM now clearly tied to EL and St. Mary Mead. The glove, the grey-coated man, and Hargrove's stopped watch at 4:50, the moment of the murder, formed a constellation of clues. She knew the killer was close, and the final stop offered her last chance to unmask them. Her trap at Willow Junction had flushed out Hargrove and the grey-coated man, but the mastermind behind Edward's death remained hidden. She resolved to bring the suspects together, to let the truth reveal itself in their reactions. As the train slowed, its whistle a mournful cry, Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. "Come, my dear," she said to EL, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll speak to the police at the station. It's time to put this to rest." EL nodded, her face pale but determined, and followed Miss Marple to the platform, where the station master's office buzzed with police activity. The inspector, his face grim, was examining the monogrammed glove. Its R-stark against the stained leather. Mrs. Pritchard stood nearby, her eyes darting, while Charles Hargrove lingered at the edge of the crowd, his polished exterior fraying. The journalist, now back, scribbled furiously, his tweed cap askew. Miss Marple approached the inspector, her demeanour unassuming but her eyes sharp. "Inspector, might I have a word? I believe we can resolve this matter here and now." She gestured to EL, Hargrove, and Mrs. Pritchard, drawing them into the office. The journalist tried to follow, but a constable barred his way, leaving the room to the key players. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Miss Marple set her knitting bag on a table, the briefcase hidden within, and began, her voice calm but commanding. "This murder has tangled us all in its web, but the truth is simple when you see it clearly. Edward, the victim, was EL's brother, killed to silence his threat to expose her whereabouts to a man named Reginald, who sought her inheritance." EL gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Miss Marple continued. "The briefcase, found in the luggage car, holds letters and a ledger proving Edward was blackmailing EL for her fortune. The initials C.H. Charles Hargrove appear in that ledger, tied to payments from a third party." Hargrove's face paled, his hand twitching toward his pocket. "That's preposterous," he snapped. "I've no connection to this girl. Or her brother." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yet your watch, Mr. Hargrove, stopped at 4:50, the exact time of the murder. And your lavender scent was near the locked compartment, where a smudge on the window suggests someone climbed out after the deed. A clever trick, locking the door from inside, but not impossible for a man of your agility." Mrs. Pritchard's bangles clinked as she leaned forward. "I knew he was suspicious. I saw him near that carriage, looking all shifty." Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing her. "But you, Mrs. Pritchard, overheard EL's confession and spread it, hoping to stir trouble. Your gossip has been useful, but it also endangered her." Mrs. Pritchard flushed, her mouth opening, then closing, turning. To the inspector, Miss Marple produced the briefcase, unlocking it with EL's key, which she discreetly kept. She laid out the photograph, letters, and ledger. These show Edward's greed, but the glove monogrammed R points to Reginald, EL's fiancé, who hired the grey-coated man to track her. But Reginald isn't here. Someone else. orchestrated this? She paused, her gaze settling on Hargrove. The ledger's payments to CH came from an account linked to a Lord Rutherford, a wealthy aristocrat in St. Mary Mead, whose monogram matches the glove. He hired you, Mr. Hargrove, to kill Edward, ensuring EL's fortune would fall into his control through Reginald, his associate. Hargrove's composure shattered. "You've no proof," he shouted, but his hand darted to his pocket, pulling. A small vial poison, Miss Marple realized, matching the traces found in Edward's autopsy report, which the inspector had shared earlier. The inspector lunged, seizing Hargrove, who struggled briefly before confessing in a broken voice. "Rutherford promised me a fortune. Edward was a loose end, knew too much about the inheritance. I climbed out the window, locked the door. The glove was Rutherford's, left to frame Reginald." EL sobbed, relief and grief mingling, as the police cuffed Hargrove. Miss Marple handed the briefcase to the inspector, her work done. The grey-coated man, she learned later, was apprehended in a nearby village, a hired thug working for Rutherford, whose arrest followed swiftly as the train emptied, its passengers dispersing into the dawn. Miss Marple stepped onto the platform, her knitting bag light without the briefcase. EL approached, her eyes wet but grateful. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You saved me." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Nonsense, my dear. People's secrets always unravel themselves, given time." She walked towards St. Mary Mead, the village. Waking under a pale sky, the mystery solved, and peace restored. The final stop had brought closure, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was content to let the world turn on, her work complete.